Listen to a sports commentator and you may notice that they keep using one particular word, great. This is a great team. They have a great defence. Great, great, great. It gets me thinking, is it just a throwaway term for us? How are you doing? I'm doing great. Well, how's everything at home? Great. What about your work? Oh, not so great. Well, now, what does it mean to be great? You may recall that the boxer Muhammad Ali described himself as great. There's a story told of him on a flight as the plane was about to take off. A young woman member of the cabin crew said to him, "Sir, you need to put your seatbelt on, please." He smiled and said, "Superman don't need no seatbelt." She smiled sweetly back at him and said, "Superman don't need no plane." He put the belt on. What is the best definition of greatness? I think if you were to ask outside the church, define greatness, they would come up with at least 4 categories. A person with power would be considered a great person, having the ability to control things around them, so power. Prestige would also fit the term great in the world's viewpoint, the accolades that are given to a person for what they have accomplished. And position would be part of their definition, the status that they have achieved. And then possessions, what a person owns. And all of that will be considered great. But the problem with using the term great is as soon as you use it for one thing, you are inferring that something else is not so great. Like a man who went to the doctor and he said, "Doctor, I am suffering from an inferiority complex." And the doctor ran a series of tests and said, "It's not a complex, you are inferior." That's a sad thing to tell anybody. Sometimes the term great shows up in a formal name. Herod the Great, Ivan the Great, Alexander the Great, Napoleon the Great. I'm turning to Daniel 8 to look at 3 people. One is mentioned by name, 2 are inferred in the text. They are Daniel, Cyrus, and Alexander, whom we know is Alexander the Great. Let's look at what greatness really is. The big question is, how can a person be great in God's estimation? That's where it matters most of all. How can I make sure that I'm not just breathing air, I'm not just occupying space, but I'm doing something noteworthy in God's estimation, something which will outlast time, something which is not just part of this world. What does it mean to be great? Now, as we get into chapter 8, I need to very briefly remind you of chapter 7. Remember, Daniel had a prophetic vision of the future. He looked ahead from his time onward through 4 successive world-governing empires to which his people, the Jews, would be subject for centuries, all the way to the second coming of Christ. And he saw 4 kingdoms. Now in chapter 8, he gives us details on the second and third of those 4 empires that he saw were coming, the Medo-Persian Empire and the Grecian Empire. Now, why is that? Because, as we'll see, the Grecian Empire is going to produce somebody who is going to persecute the Jewish people, that he'll be like the Antichrist will be way off in the future. So it's written to comfort the Jewish people in captivity, in exile, that though hard times are coming, God still has a plan for them. And that includes the coming kingdom. So let's consider three people, the great and the not so great. Let's consider this. First, Daniel. Notice in verse 1 that his name is mentioned as it's also mentioned in the last verse, verse 27. But in the first verse we read, in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. Most people in our culture would not consider Daniel to be great. Oh yes, he made it up the ladder to become the prime minister of the Babylonian Empire, but he was despised as a person because of his Jewish background, and he was part of the Jewish captive race. He was part of a conquered people, and that brings a shame with it. You're a loser. And certainly Daniel wouldn't be put in Time magazine's Person of the Year award or the top 10 most influential people. But to God, Daniel was great. Even when we get to Daniel 5, when King Belshazzar is on the throne, this king brings all the wise men of Babylon before him, except Daniel. He was marginalised and kept away from the group. Let's not bring Daniel in, let's bring the guys in with the worldly wisdom. It's like the boy or girl that's the last pick when people are choosing teams. Daniel could have felt like that, but again, in God's estimation, he was great. And why? Because he's the person that gets the revelation of the future. So power, prestige, position and possessions, God looks at all of that and goes, not interested. Jesus put it this way, what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. You see, he isn't impressed with that kind of stuff. What the world sees as great, God goes empty, nothing, and what the world despises, often God will extol. Consider John the Baptist, an eccentric, unpredictable rabble-rouser who ate bugs out in the desert and said, repent, to everyone he could find. People wouldn't consider him great, but Jesus Christ said, I tell you, of all who have ever been born of women, there is none greater than John the Baptist. He was great. Daniel was great. Later, an angel will touch him, saying, Daniel, you are highly esteemed. We think a lot of you in heaven. Okay, but what made him so great? 3 qualities are found in him. First, he was a humble man. Did you notice how verse 1 was phrased? I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. The language reveals an amazement. Can you believe it? God keeps showing me all these dreams and visions of the future. Amazing. That's humility. You know, some Christians too easily say, God spoke to me. Make sure God really spoke to you if you say that. Well, God showed me. That's cool, if God indeed showed you. But here's Daniel, you see, saying, can you believe it? Isn't this staggering? Even I, Daniel. A Chinese proverb says, great men never know that they're great. Moses was like that. When God called him at the burning bush, he said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And there's Paul, the apostle, who knew what he used to be before he came to Christ and never let go of that memory. Unto me, the one who is less than the least of all the saints, is this grace given. So, a great person is one who bows before a great God. That's humility. A second characteristic that made Daniel great was singularity. He had a one-track mind. When he was young, he made a decision. He purposed in his heart not to defile himself with a portion of the king's food. And in virtually every situation, Daniel pointed up to God. When he stood before Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, or before Darius the Mede, he pointed up to God. He had a one-track mind. So, a great person is one who bows before God and points toward God. And then thirdly, Daniel was great because of his humility and singularity, but also his consistency. What he was as a youth, he continued to be all the way through his long life. He was known for this by the pagans around him. A great person is one who bows before God, points towards God, and one who is faithful to God over time. Two brothers in Scotland were having a discussion after their Sunday school class. One brother said that he wanted to be rich and famous. The second brother said his goal was to follow Christ to the fullest. That second brother achieved his goal. He was the famous David Livingstone, the missionary medical doctor and explorer of Africa. His brother became rich, but his fame wasn't due to his wealth, but to the fact that he was David Livingstone's brother. When John Livingstone died, on his grave were written these words: "Here lies John Livingstone, the brother of David Livingstone." David Livingstone was a great man. Why? Because he was humble, single-minded, and consistent. That's greatness. Would you rather be king of the hill for a day or a child of God for eternity? Parents, you want your child to be great, of course you do. But how do we define greatness? Making a living or making a life? Yes, grades are important and we make a big deal out of them. You got a C, you need to make at least a B. You have it in you to make an A, but you at least have to make a B. Okay, grades are important, but are they that important? Build within your children the goal of being a great person in the style of Daniel. If they don't get picked for the team or pass the exam, but they have what was said of Daniel, an excellent spirit, you have a great child. Daniel was great. Let's look at a second person, not named, but inferred. A Persian named Cyrus. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. Now, get this. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with two horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was larger than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Another weird vision, right? Did Daniel's late night snacks get to him, do you think? Daniel had this in chapter 7 and now again and it's getting weirder with each vision. You know, I find it fascinating that God reveals himself sometimes through dreams and visions. And if we have the picture of the biblical author sitting in a dim room with a candle and they're taking dictation as God's voice is coming through the walls, we have got it wrong. Sometimes they wrote poetry, sometimes narrative, and sometimes they saw an animation before them, like this very wild cartoon of these animals where one thing represented something else. First, in his vision, he is not where he is in person. In person, he's in Babylon. In the vision, he isn't there. He is transported 350 miles to the east in the headquarters of the Medo-Persian Empire, where Cyrus the Great was setting up his kingdom. Shushan the citadel. He sees in the vision a ram with 2 horns. What's odd about those horns is one grows up, then a second grows up, and it's much more notable and bigger than the other. So, this is like a ram with an attitude that he sees. This ferocious ram, Rambo. Just want to see if you're awake. Why a ram? Because the ram was the animal that depicted the Medo-Persian Empire, just like the eagle is the bird that has been chosen to represent the USA, or for Great Britain, a lion, or a bear from the Soviet Republic in times past. The ram, what was on the coins of the Persian Empire, was the ram. The ancient coins have a head of a ram on one side, a recumbent ram on the other. The king of Persia would often wear as the crown a gold jewel-studded head of a ram. The armies march with a banner of a ram on their banners above them and on shields that they wore. So, like the 2 horns, the Medo-Persian Empire would come in 2 parts, Media and Persia. Media came first, and it was a significant power. Persia was an insignificant power at the time that Daniel was writing, but it was growing in notoriety. And it was Cyrus the Great, as he was called, and his son Cambyses II, who brought a Medo-Persian coalition so that the second part of the empire, the Persian Empire, grew in strength bigger. And by this coalition, they became a world governing power that was the biggest to that date. They had an interesting strategy. They first marched westward and took Babylon and Mesopotamia, Syria and Asia Minor, including Macedonia. Then they marched northward and conquered Colchis, where the region of the ancient Georgia and the Soviet Republic, Armenia, Iberia, and the lands around the Caspian Sea were. And then they conquered southward, seizing Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia. Did you know their armies were so large that no single nation nor coalition of nations could stop them? And you see what's happening here? Daniel sees all that ahead of time. Question: how could Daniel know? Well, that's the whole point. He couldn't know. This wasn't some food-induced vision. This was a revelation of God. He was telling him what is going to happen. Now, notice in verse 4, nothing could stop this man. Nothing. The Medo-Persian kingdom was great. Cyrus was Cyrus the Great. He would make it in Time magazine's top 10 most influential people list. But you know, the problem is, when you're great as an emperor, There's always somebody greater around the corner. And Cyrus would learn that the powers that be will someday become the powers that have been. Daniel was great. Cyrus thought he was great. But somebody greater was right around the corner. Verse 5 tells us, "As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came towards the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven." So we have a goat with a prominent horn that moves like lightning speed. His feet don't even touch the ground. From the west towards the east, you get the picture? This is a Formula One speed goat. It's moving from the west towards the east, and we don't have to guess who this is. Just like we don't have to guess that the first emperor is Cyrus the Great, part of the Medo-Persian Empire. Move ahead and look at verse 20. Daniel is told, "The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power." So we know who the 4th king was. It's Alexander the Great, the son of Philip of Macedon. When Alexander was growing up, his dad was a soldier and head of the Macedonian Empire. Philip didn't think his son would amount to much. Alexander was an indoor child and bookworm. He wouldn't go outside and play army games like the other boys. And Philip was a warrior. As his son liked reading books and studying, Philip gave him a tutor named Aristotle. And he taught him until he was aged 19 when Philip, his dad, died. And when he died, something rose within Alexander to want to become a great soldier like his father and avenge his father's death, especially against the Persians who had attacked 150 years prior that empire that they were living in and had never been forgotten in Greece. First moment of opportunity, get your own back. Alexander amassed an army, not large in comparison to Medo-Persia, but very fast. And he moved from West Greece toward the east, and wherever he went, he slaughtered thousands of people and sold people groups into the hands of others. For instance, he came to the city of Tyre and asked for supplies for his men because they wouldn't give him supplies. He decimated every citizen of Tyre. He moved south toward Egypt, and after conquering Egypt, he moved north towards Medo-Persian and that empire, and he finally crushed them at the ancient city of Nineveh. After crushing and defeating them, he attacked Shushan and finally other places And in verse 8, notice, the goat became very great. His dad said, "You're not going to amount to much." He became great. History tells us that Alexander's mother convinced him that he was divine, that he wasn't really the son of Philip of Macedon, but he was the son of the gods, and that he was that great. So he went around telling people, "I'm divine. My mum said so." It didn't go over well with his generals. But notice in verse 8, at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. And on June the 10th, 332 BC, in Babylon, after conquering the world, it took him 10 to 12 years to do it very swiftly. His feet were hardly touching the ground. At age 33, Alexander the Great died. He had been drinking the night before. Some say he was poisoned. Most historians say he just got a fever out of nowhere, and the next day he died. They divided up his kingdom between the generals. Guess how many generals? 4 generals, just like the vision predicts. Alexander the Great, the horn was broken. So great, so vulnerable, so weak, he caught a virus and died. There was a reporter who asked the great Walt Disney, the theme park maker, the movie maker, etc., etc., "How do you feel about being such a great celebrity?" I think his answer is classic. He said, "Well, it's pretty good, especially when you want to get good seats at football games or great tables in restaurants." But then he added, "But being a great celebrity has never helped me make a good picture, nor command the obedience of my daughter, nor impress my wife. It doesn't even keep the fleas off of our dogs. And if being a great celebrity won't give me the advantage over a couple of fleas, I guess I can't be that great after all." Isn't that classic? In other words, if you're not a great dad and a great husband and even a pet owner, I don't care what else you're great at, you're not that great. Kings don't impress God. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Conquerors don't impress God. One day, through Jesus Christ, he will conquer the world that he created. Movie stars and executives and musicians and politicians, none of them ever make God say, "a cut above the rest." There's only one type of person that God would take note of and say, "Ah, that person's great." And you know what kind of person that is? Well, do you remember when the 12 disciples were arguing among themselves as to who would be the greatest in the kingdom of God? Can you imagine that argument? Peter going, "I'm going to be the greatest. I'm Peter. He called me the Rock. I have a bigger beard than you guys. I'm always first in the list of the 12 disciples. You're not. I'm going to be the greatest." Or John and James going, "I don't think so. You couldn't fish all that great anyway. You've got your mother-in-law living with you. I think you're greater than you are. I think I'm greater than you are, actually. Not you, me." So they argued, who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom? And Jesus said, "The greatest among you will be your servant." That's a great person. The person who willingly serves. Humility. Do we want to be great? Serve our wives, husbands, children, fellow workers, friends. This is just me. This is just a personal thing, and I certainly wouldn't want to put it on others, but I don't like phrases such as senior leader in the church. That's just me. I prefer to be servant, somebody who serves others. You see, the greatest example is Jesus Christ, who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but he humbled himself and became a servant. He was great. I mentioned that Alexander the Great died at age 33. How old was Jesus when he died? 33, but what a contrast. Alexander the Great, Jesus the Great, Jesus the Christ. I close with this little poem. Jesus and Alexander died at 33. One lived and died for self, one died for you and me. The Greek died on a throne, the Jew died on a cross. One's life a triumph seemed, the other but a loss. One led vast armies forth, the other walked alone. One shed a whole world's blood, the other gave his own. Jesus and Alexander died at 33. One died in Babylon and one on Calvary. One gained all for self and one himself he gave. One conquered every tongue, the other every grave. The one made himself a god, the other made himself less. The one lived but to blast, the other but to bless. Jesus and Alexander died at 33. The Greek made all men slaves, the Jew made all men free. King for a day, a child of God for eternity. Serving, bowing, and that's great. And that's why we can trust our wonderful Saviour and sovereign King, who wants the best for us, and he will work it out in his time. The late S.M. Lockridge wrote an encouragement. Let me pick out a few lines that I recall. He's the greatest phenomenon that has ever crossed the horizon of the world. He's God's Son. He's the sinner's Saviour. He's the centrepiece of civilization. I'm trying to tell you, church, you can trust him. His life is matchless. His goodness is limitless. His mercy is everlasting. His word is enough. His grace is sufficient. His reign is righteous. His burden is light. I wish I could describe him to you. He's indescribable because he's incomprehensible. He's irresistible and he's invincible. You can't get him off your hands and you can't get him out of your mind. You can't outlive him and you can't live without him. Death couldn't handle him, and thank God, the grave couldn't hold him. He is true greatness. You can trust him.